The hour of 10:30 having arrived, I'm calling the Higher Education Finance Committee to order. Members, it's my intention for the foreseeable future to focus on budget, not on members' bills, and I've already had several discussions with some members. I will have a discussion with all of you about that as we proceed. So the first item on the agenda is a presentation from Nonpartisan House Research. We'll have members do questions at the end of each presentation. So with that, gentlemen, welcome to the committee. Please introduce yourself for the record.
Mr. Chair and members, my name is Nathan Hopkins. I'm a nonpartisan legislative analyst with the House Research Department.
Mr. Chair and members, Ken Savory, nonpartisan House Fiscal Analysis.
Which one's going first? Mr. Hopkins, proceed.
Mr. Chair and members, so we were asked to give a presentation about this committee's jurisdiction, so I'm going to focus on that first piece. And the way that I sort of thought about that issue was asking the question, well, what does this committee do? Some of you have been on this committee before, and some of you are brand new, so I thought this was a good way to frame the issue for everyone. And the question, what does this committee do, really boils down to the question, well, what does the state of Minnesota do regarding higher education? And what I'm going to talk about now are what the state of Minnesota currently does regarding higher education, with some sort of historical background as well. And that historical background is really meant to show you that just because this is the way higher education operates now, it doesn't mean that's the way it always has to operate. It operates this way because that's how past legislatures wanted it to operate, and you are able to change that. So just because this is the way it is now doesn't mean that's the way it has to be.
Mr. Hopkins, the chair appreciates that statement a great deal.
There are really three main categories that I wanted to focus on with this presentation. The first is the Office of Higher Education. That's the executive branch agency that really deals with higher education. These are the main sort of things that they do, and I'm going to go into all of these in much greater detail. The Office of Higher Education administers financial aid programs, including self-loan and self-refinancing programs. It deals with consumer protection by licensing and regulating post-secondary institutions. The office collects information and data and performs research on that data. They provide consumer-facing navigational resources and services, so student-facing resources, parent-facing resources to help people that are entering higher education or looking to re-enter higher education. They administer the state's 529 college savings plan. That is something I will not be going deep into detail about. It's not something that I'm personally very familiar with, but if you have questions, I will do my best to follow up with you later on that. And they also negotiate the state's interstate tuition reciprocity agreements. This presentation also doesn't go deep into detail on tuition reciprocity, but similarly, if you have questions, please let me know and I can get you some information to follow up. The second main category we'll be focusing on is the University of Minnesota system. And the way I sort of characterize this for this presentation is that there are two main things that they do. They educate students and they conduct research. And then finally, the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, or MnState system, which also educates students. And research happens at Minnesota State Colleges and Universities as well, but the sort of special feature that I'd like to focus on with MnState is training the state's workforce and workforce development. The University of Minnesota, of course, also contributes to the state's workforce, but the state colleges and universities have a special role here. So first, the Minnesota Office of Higher Education. A bit about the structure of OHE. It is a creature of statute. It was created by the legislature in it's codified at section 136A.01. It is run by a commissioner, who's currently Commissioner Dennis Olson. He is appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the Senate. Currently, OHE has about 69 full-time employees. There are two councils, or one council within OHE to mention the Student Advisory Council. This is also a creature of statute. That is made up of student representatives from all the various institution types: University of Minnesota, state colleges, state university, private colleges, tribal colleges, and they help advise OHE about higher education in Minnesota. They provide input and feedback from a student perspective. Previously, until 2013, there was also a Higher Education Advisory Council, and that consisted of representatives from various institutions. So they weren't student representatives, they represented the institutions themselves. OHE organizes itself into 5 main program areas: student financial aid services, self-loans and self-refinancing, research, policy, and analysis, post-secondary access and outreach, so that's that student-facing, parent-facing component, and then agency administration. And that's going to also include their auditing, the consumer protection, so the licensing and regulating of post-secondary institutions, and the administration of the state's 529 college savings plan. Just quickly, a little bit of background about OHE's history. The basic function of OHE has remained the same for a long time, but its composition and structure has changed. From 1975 to 1995, it was called the Higher Education Coordinating Board, and that was a board of 11 governor-appointed citizens, and then that board would appoint an executive director of the Higher Education Coordinating Board. From 1995 to 2005, the name was changed to the Higher Education Services Office, and then you had a council of nine governor-appointed citizens, and that council would appoint the director of the services office. And now, from 2005 to the present, you have the current form, the Office of Higher Education. It's changed slightly. Now it is the commissioner is a commissioner and not a director of the office. But now it is a full cabinet-level executive agency, and the director of OHE is appointed directly by the governor. So in general, the trend is towards greater professionalization of the office. I'm going to talk a little bit about the state's attainment goal, the higher education attainment goal. This is a good example of OHE's data collection and research function. And it's also a very helpful framework for members of this committee to think about their approach and the committee's approach and the legislature's approach to higher education in Minnesota. So the attainment goal was enacted by the legislature in 2015. And the goal that is set is that the number of Minnesota residents ages 25 to 44 who hold post-secondary degrees or certificates should be at least 70% by 2025. So the goal is by 2025, 70% of Minnesotans 25 to 44 years have some kind of post-secondary degree or certificate. Another thing, usually when you see attainment goal data, it's going to be disaggregated by racial and ethnic group. And that's also called for in the statute. The statute says that OHE should use benchmarks of 30% or higher and 50% or higher for the various racial or ethnic groups to sort of show the progress, how the progress breaks down across those demographics. This is a chart from the Office of Higher Education showing where we're at in terms of the state's attainment goal for 2021. And the all category is all of Minnesota. So you see it's at, for 2021, 62.5%. So not quite at that 70% goal yet. One of the main things that this committee is likely to focus on when it comes to the Office of Higher Education is its administration of state financial aid programs. And there are a few big ones that are listed here. The main one is the state grant program. I'm going to go into more detail about most of these. The state grant program provides need-based financial aid to resident undergraduates in Minnesota. The self-loan and self-loan refinancing programs. These are self-sustaining programs. You won't see appropriations for them. They offer low-interest student loans and student loan refinancing. Work-study grants. This helps support wages for part-time students who do on or off-campus jobs while they're studying. And various other targeted grant and scholarship programs. So these could go to current students in the forms of scholarships and grants, or they could also go to recent graduates. And oftentimes programs that provide funds to recent graduates are sometimes called loan forgiveness programs. The state of Minnesota doesn't, unless it issues the loan in the form of a self-loan, it can't forgive the loan. Really, these are grants to help students repay existing student loans. And some examples of these are child care grants for student parents Indian scholarships, the Fostering Independence Grant Program for former foster youth, and we have a number of programs also focused on teachers, student teachers, and recently graduated teachers. So the largest financial aid program is the state grant program. So I'm going to go into some detail here about how the state grant program works. It was established in 1969. It's a need-based program, so students apply for it using the federal FAFSA form. And there's also a DREAM Act form for undocumented students that can't apply through FAFSA to apply for a state grant separately. And another feature of it, and this will come up a lot more when I get into the formula for calculating student awards, but it's designed with this idea of the design for shared responsibility. So the concept is that the student, the student's family, and the taxpayer are all sharing in the financial burden of post-secondary education. Everybody's got skin in the game. That's something that that's a phrase you'll hear a lot. Eligibility for a state grant. You have to be a Minnesota resident. You have to be an undergraduate. You can be full-time or part-time, but awards are prorated for part-time students based on how many hours they're enrolled. It funds up to 8 semesters of full-time enrollment, so basically a normal 4-year path to a baccalaureate degree. You have to attend an eligible institution, and what that means is all of our public post-secondary institutions, your University of Minnesota system, Minnesota State colleges and universities, but you can also attend a private institution as long as and in order to be eligible, a private institution in Minnesota has to be licensed or registered with OHE, it has to maintain academic standards, and it must participate in the federal Pell Grant program. Some quick figures from fiscal year 2021 about the state grant program to 71,889 students. Total awards were $201 million. Average award was $2,790. But because it's a need-based program, you're going to see much larger average awards for lower income students. 57% of state grant recipients in fiscal year 2021 had family incomes below 40K. So this chart from the Office of Higher Education shows the average combined federal Pell in the dark blue and Minnesota State Grant Award in the stripey received by students broken down by family adjusted gross income. So to the left of the chart, you see students with lower family adjusted gross incomes. To the right of the chart are students with higher adjusted gross incomes. So you're seeing awards around $6,000 for $6,000 for students whose family adjusted gross incomes are $50,000 or less. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the state grant award formula. This is in statute. It is something that the legislature in past years has changed and amended in order to typically increase state grant awards for students. And there are a few features. So a student's grant amount is going to equal the cost of attendance for the institution minus the assigned student responsibility. This gets into that design for shared responsibility, the idea that everyone's supposed to be contributing and having skin in the game. Cost of attendance minus the assigned student responsibility minus the assigned family responsibility minus the federal Pell Grant dollars for which a student is eligible. So this is always stacked on top of your Pell Grant that you get from the federal government. The cost of attendance for an institution is tuition and fees plus living and miscellaneous expenses, or LME. The legislature, in statute, there is a default amount for the living and miscellaneous expense allowance. Currently, it is set at 109% of the federal poverty guidelines for a one-person household in Minnesota for 9 months. So the idea of 9 months being a typical academic year, not including a summer term. That is something the legislature has adjusted in past years recently. Also, this is important to keep in mind with regard to private institutions, because we know that students that attend private institutions in Minnesota can receive a state grant award. So for private institutions, tuition and fees are capped at the highest equivalent public institution. So if it's a 2-year institution or a 4-year institution, typically that means the cap is going to be at the tuition and fees for the University of Minnesota Twin Cities for 4-year schools. So you're not paying the state, in terms of the state grant program, is not paying that premium for a private college education in some of the more expensive private college institutions, which have larger sticker prices. The assigned student responsibility is 50% of the cost of attendance. That's part of the design for shared responsibility. The assigned family responsibility is determined by the FAFSA. So it's the FAFSA determined family contribution, but it's adjusted and multiplied in statute. And this is another thing the legislature has adjusted in past years in order to change the amounts of state grant. So it's adjusted by 35% if the student is independent without children. It's multiplied by 71% if the student is independent with children, and 79% if the student is a dependent student. And the Pell Grant, of course, is the amount of the federal Pell Grant award for which an applicant is eligible, not necessarily the amount that they receive. Some students might not be eligible to receive Pell Grants, but they can still receive state grant awards. So the idea is that we aren't going to punish them for because the federal government has decided they're not eligible for Pell if the state of Minnesota has decided we want them to get a state grant. Also, very important point, OE has authority in statute to reduce or increase awards in order to accommodate an insufficient or surplus appropriation for this program. That's typically in the second year. If there's more money in the state grant than they need, they will increase awards to students. All right, now moving on to the SELF loan program. SELF stands for Student Education Loan Fund. This is a self-sustaining program. There's no appropriation. It provides low-interest loans to students for post-secondary education. There's no income limit. Anyone, whether you're a Minnesota resident or not, if you're enrolled in an eligible Minnesota school, you can apply for one of these. And if you're a Minnesota resident who's enrolled in an eligible out-of-state school, you can also get a SELF loan. You have to be enrolled at least half-time in a post-secondary program, be making satisfactory academic progress, be up to date on student loan payments, and have a credit-worthy cosigner, which are pretty typical requirements. A lot of these features of the SELF loan program that I'm going to give you right now aren't based on statute. As this slide says, the SELF loan statute, 136A.1701, is not a highly prescriptive statute. The office has a lot of authority, a lot of ability within that statute to adjust the parameters of the program based on how, like the overall financial circumstances of the country and what the program's able to actually do. Nevertheless, current fixed rate of 6.35%. One statutory thing that is fixed in statute is that total loans to individual students must not exceed $140,000. And in this slide, you can see the current loan limits, annual and cumulative, for students borrowing. A bit of information. So currently, student loan, you have current total of over 32,000 borrowers who owe a total of $419 million. In fiscal year 2022, the SELF loan program dispersed $57 million in total loans to 5,946 students, and the average loan was $9,598. Also, in addition to the SELF loan program, there's the SELF loan refinancing program. So this allows students to refinance existing educational loans at a lower interest rate. Like the SELF loan program, this is a self-sustaining program, so it's funded by the payments received from borrowers, so it does not get a legislative appropriation. It's a newer program. It was established by the legislature in 2014, and the first loans were issued in 2016. In 2021, the legislature expanded the capacity of the program. Unlike the SELF loan program, the statute for the SELF loan refinancing program is more prescriptive about what the office is able to offer in terms of the total program load and the maximum individual loan. So the total program load in 2021 was increased from $100 million to $300 million, and the maximum individual loan that could be refinanced went from $70,000 to $200,000. Eligibility for self-loan refinancing. It's only for Minnesota residents. You have to have earned a post-secondary credential. You have to be currently employed or have a spouse as a cosigner. You have to meet certain credit and debt-to-income requirements. And there's also an option, if you do not meet those credit or debt-to-income requirements, to have someone co-sign for your loan. The current maximum individual loan is $150,000, and the current program totals, again, this is a newer program, but it's currently at 500 borrowers who owe a total of $10 million. So here I've just kind of listed, because there are many of them, some of the other targeted financial aid programs that OHE administers. I say targeted because these are typically focused on a certain kind of student. So you have the post-secondary child care grant. These are focused on students who have kids and need help getting child care for their kids while they're studying. The safety officer survivor grants, students whose parents, who might be the parent of a police officer who died in the line of duty, Indian scholarships, the work study program, fostering independence higher education grants for former foster students. There are a couple different student teacher grants for underrepresented racial and ethnic groups and for student teachers who are going on to teach in a rural district or in a teacher license shortage area. On the right-hand side of this list are some of those loan repayment programs. So these are focused not on current students currently in school, but people who've recently graduated. And you can see that these are really targeted at certain sort of workforce or career groups. So teachers, agricultural educators, people who have aviation degrees, rural veterinarians. So these are some of the loan forgiveness programs that are currently in statute that OHE administers. One other program that I wanted to call out because it's rather unique that OHE administers is the Dual Training Competency Grant. This was established in 2015 since statute 136A.246. OHE works with the Department of Labor and Industry on administering this program. And this is interesting because these are grants to employers. And the idea is that it's going to reimburse expenses for employers to get their employees to earn industry-recognized degrees or credentials. So an employer partners with a training provider, typically a post-secondary institution, to get an employee formal related instruction combined with on-the-job employee training. And there are a few eligible fields for the dual training competency program right now, and that's advanced manufacturing, healthcare services, information technology, and agriculture. So you can see the legislature is sort of focusing here, and the state focusing here on certain, especially in-demand career fields. Moving away sort of from OHE's role in administering financial aid programs and towards the consumer protection role of licensing and regulating post-secondary institutions. There are two main acts within the statutes that deal with this role that OHE plays. There's one that's focused on private and out-of-state public post-secondary educations. So these are degree granting programs. They could be public, private, for-profit, nonprofit, but these are degree granting programs, associate's degrees, baccalaureate degrees, schools that give out those kinds of credentials. And then you have the Private Career School Act, and this is the act under which OHE regulates institutions that grant credentials at less than associate degrees, so cosmetology and things along those lines. And so the main sort of role that OHE plays in terms of consumer protection here is licensing and registering these institutions, sort of making sure there aren't like fly-by-night post-secondary institutions operating within the state. They set minimum requirements for the institutions, for instance, regarding the retention of student records. They will receive and investigate student complaints. They will assess the financial viability of schools and help with school closures. And those two things are related. If a school is no longer financially viable, it might have to close down, and then you're left with students who aren't able to finish their degree at that school. So OHE has been very helpful in past years when this happens, getting those students at the closed institution into other institutions and helping redirect them and helping sort of smooth that path to closure. And that wraps up the OHE part of this presentation.
Mr. Hopkins, can I have you go back to slide 7, please? You characterize this as a push to professionalism, and I want to emphasize what type of professionalism was done here. The chair was involved in all 3 of these renditions of the Office of Higher Education. The reliability of the office was often called in question, and that's why you saw the changes in that office, and they were extreme. We will, at our next hearing, begin a process of taking a look at some of the numbers that we would once get from the Office of Higher Education, but now need to be extremely reliable, and that deals with the number of students that are attending our institutions and the process of how those students have either gone up or down as far as enrollment. So when you saw on page or on slide 7, the different creations of this agency, it was done so that we would get reliable information when we were doing budgets. I realize this is a rather long presentation, but when these agencies come up and they do a budget request, I want you to at least have some knowledge of what that budget goes into as we begin to process this. So the reliability of data now will be critical to us. We, for the first time in a long time, have resources. I want to make sure those resources are put to the best use for the entire state. So members, anyone else have any questions at this point? Representative Cleburne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and this is probably directed to you. If you choose to take it another direction, I'll defer to your discretion. One of the pieces I would like to know, and it's something I've never understood, the state grant program, as was just described to us, allows private students going to private colleges to receive the cap up to the limit of the University of Minnesota tuition. Now, the University of Minnesota, as we heard described earlier today, is both an academic institution and a research institution. It's a premier institution. Without grading our private colleges and universities, that's not my intent, but they are primarily academic institutions without the added concern of research or the same professors. Why is it that the state grant uses the University of Minnesota tuition when it would make more sense to me that it would be that our private institutions would be more comparable to our state four-year institutions that are on the same academic balance? So I'll just leave that question for you to decide, and it might be information we just explore later in the year.
Representative Cleburne, that's a good question, and I just alerted our staff. We will put that in the presentation from the Office of Higher Education.
Okay.
So when you have a question like that, we'll plug it into their presentation so you can get your answer right away. Sometimes in these hearings, members ask questions and they want data, and the only time they get the data may be decades later. I would like you to get the data before we actually do the budgets so that you can act on it. And the grant program will be a critical component now of how we're going to change the funding for higher education. Representative Scott, did you have a question?
I do, but I think Representative O'Neill was in front of me. Okay. I had a question on slide 13, and it does pertain to data. The state grant program there, 71,889 students are recipients, and what percentage of total student enrollment actually receive one of these grants would be one question. And then, what percentage of these students or how many actually go on to graduate in the programs that they're enrolled in when they take the loans out, if anybody knows?
Mr. Hopkins, can you answer that, or?
Mr. Chair, Representative Scott, I cannot answer that right now, but we can try to get that information and follow up.
And Representative Scott, again, we'll put that on the agenda for the Office of Higher Education.
Thank you.
Representative
Thank you.
O'Neill, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's interesting that Representative Scott and I think so much alike. I literally wrote down the same question just so that we get a sense as to how many total students we have. But back on slide 12, I have a different question, and it's just really quickly. If you happen to know how long someone has to live in Minnesota to establish residency, specifically for financial aid in Minnesota.
Mr. Hopkins?
Mr. Chair, Representative O'Neill, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I can follow up with you on that. So I know that for the DREAM Act, a student has to have attended a Minnesota, graduated or attended a Minnesota high school, I believe for 3 years, to be eligible to receive a state grant under the DREAM Act. And that's in the resident tuition rate, 3 years there. For the University of Minnesota and for Minnesota State colleges and universities, for their resident tuition rates, they require you to be in Minnesota for 1 calendar year before your first day at the school in order to get resident tuition. And you can't, you have to have not attended another post-secondary institution during that calendar year. But that's for the resident tuition rate, not for eligibility for a state grant. So I'm not sure, but let me follow up with you on that.
Representative O'Neill, when the office does its presentation, I want the office to respond directly by name of the representative in the question. So we'll make sure that there's a direct answer to your question when the office does a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative-
I'm sorry, Mr.
I'm
Chair,
sorry,
could I ask
Representative
one other
O'Neill.
quick
Go
question?
ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that would be helpful because I think it also gives us a good sense as to who we're doing loans and tuition assistance to. And then just really quickly about the dual training competency grants, which I actually helped to write. I wrote that with Chair Bonoff that year. And unless things have changed, and maybe I'm just parsing words here, but you had said that it's grants to the employers, but it's grants on behalf of the student to pay for the higher education training that they're receiving. Okay, good. So it hasn't changed drastically since 2000. Okay. So I just wanted to be clear. It's not exactly grants to the employer. In fact, the employer actually has to match. So the employer has to put up some money. They have to be hired by this employer. And then the difference, it's kind of a 50-50 match, at least when I wrote it. That goes to pay for the higher institutions training, whether it's, in manufacturing or something else. So, okay, so it hasn't changed. Okay, awesome. And that's all I had. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Hopkins, did you need to respond, or did Representative O'Neill respond for you?
No, that's right. The dual training competency grant funds the employee's education.
Representative Coulter?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, the state grants, are the 8 semesters of awards, is that a lifetime limit, or does that?
That is the,
Mr. Hopkins?
yes, that is, Mr. Chair, that is a lifetime limit. So if you already have a baccalaureate degree, you're not eligible, is another sort of feature to the eligibility. So if you already have a baccalaureate degree, you can't use a state grant to get an additional one or to get additional education.
Thank you.
Mr. Hopkins, if you had to characterize the office primary function, what is the primary function of the Office of Higher Education?
Mr. Chair, I think that there wouldn't be just one. Administering financial aid programs is probably the one that this committee is going to focus on the most with the Office of Higher Education, but of course there's also the consumer protection side and the consumer-facing navigation, things like that.
Mr. Hopkins, it's also the repository of our federal dollars that come into the state, and that's why when we had the 3 different versions of this office, there were issues with how those numbers were handled and what was done with those. So this office had once a very narrow function. It has a much broader function now. And we may want to add to that or delete those functions. But at least this is a start at a good presentation when the office does make its budget request about what and how we might change it. Any further questions here? I'm sorry, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Representative, or Chair Pulaski. I wondered if we could also get some information on the default rates and amounts on each loan program.
Representative Scott, we will do that.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Hopkins, are you still up?
Yep, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to quickly circle back to Representative Cleburne's point about the cap on the state grant program. By statute, it's capped at the highest equivalent public institution divided by whether it's a 2-year institution or a 4-year institution. So it's not, in statute, it isn't the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. I didn't want to mislead anyone about that. It's just the University of Minnesota Twin Cities tends to be the institution that has the highest 4-year, that is the most expensive 4-year public school. So a state college, the average tuition at a state university is $9,894, and the tuition at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is $16,108. So the highest tuition is the one that's used for the cap.
Representative Cleburne.
And thank you, Mr. Hopkins, for that clarification. But Chair, that goes exactly to my point of equivalency. One is a 4-year institution for academics only, and the other is an institution of academics and research. So the cost burden that would be shared by the students at the University of Minnesota would, well, anyway, their mission is not the same. I'll just leave it at that. And so the question is equivalency. Thank
And
you.
it's a pertinent question.
Thank you
So-
very much, Mr. Chair.
And I would raise it again when the office makes its presentation, and it may come up at the University of Minnesota also. Any further questions on this section? None? All right, Mr. Hopkins?
Mr. Chair and members, for the next section, I'm going to be talking about the University of Minnesota system. The University of Minnesota system has 5 separate campuses at the Twin Cities, Duluth, Morris, Rochester, and Crookston. You can see some sort of very basic information about enrollments and tuition here in this slide. Not going to go through all of it. Just a few highlights. The Twin Cities campus is really the flagship campus. It's where a great deal of the research happens. The law school is there. The medical school is there. There's also some medical school departments in Duluth as well. University at the Morris campus, this is a liberal arts college within the system, and it's one really unique feature of that is that it offers free tuition for American Indian students, whether they're Minnesota residents or not. That's related to the institution's history as a Indian boarding school. Rochester is the newest campus within the system, and it is focused on undergraduate health sciences. It's also the smallest campus. And Crookston is very unique in its focus on online learning. So those are just a few sort of highlights of some of the distinctive features of these 5 different campuses. So in addition to educating students at sort of the table of contents slide, I talked about the U having a very unique role in terms of research. And there's so much research that happens at the University of Minnesota. There's no way to talk about all of it, but two things that the legislature has focused a lot on in the past and that this committee might be wanting to focus on that I highlight in this slide. One is the MinDrive program. That stands for Minnesota's Discovery, Research, and Innovation Economy. And this is a partnership between the University of Minnesota and the state. There is state funding for this program. The idea is to align university research strengths with the state's key and emerging industries. So it focuses on 5 different areas: robotics, global food, environment, brain conditions, and cancer clinical trials. Also, this is not something that the legislature funds specifically. It's not a legislative program, but there is a whole office at the university dedicated to technology commercialization. And one thing that this committee's focused on in past years with university research is its economic impact on the state. And this department or division office within the University of Minnesota is a great resource to learn more about that. They deal with licensing university intellectual property. They help launch startups based on discoveries and inventions at the university. Just 2 quick figures. In 2022, they brought in $16.1 million in licensing revenue from university IP licensing, and 241 new patents were issued based on University of Minnesota discoveries in 2022. Another feature of the university that I wanted to discuss was the extension service. The extension service exists in every county throughout the state. There are several regional offices, but they work in every single county statewide. They run 4-H programs for youth, and they provide information and community services for individuals and for local units of government regarding food, agriculture, lawn, gardening, public health, natural resources, and community development. 65% of the Extension Service staff is in Greater Minnesota. So at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about how this presentation was going to talk about the way higher education operates in Minnesota right now, and that you all are empowered to change that direction. And this is a small caveat to that in terms of the legislature's ability to affect higher education in Minnesota. And so I wanted to talk about the University of Minnesota's constitutional autonomy status, because this comes up a lot. Historical background is important here. So the University of Minnesota was founded in 1851. The territorial legislature passed what is now and still is the University of Minnesota's charter in 1851 by law. It's Chapter 3 in that section's laws. You can go look it up at the Legislative Reference Library. And so the University of Minnesota predates Minnesota's statehood. Minnesota became a state in 1858. And when it became a state, our state's constitution essentially incorporated the University of Minnesota charter by reference. And you can see that in this excerpt here. It's Article 13, Section 3 of the Constitution, and it says, all rights, immunities, franchises, and endowments heretofore granted or conferred upon the University of Minnesota are perpetuated unto the university. And this idea has been developed in the courts. There are not a lot of cases about this, but there are a few. Into this idea of the University of Minnesota's constitutional autonomy. And the idea is that it has a separate status different from other state systems and state agencies that are creations of the legislature, because it exists in the Constitution. And there are 3 real principles to constitutional autonomy that I wanted to just briefly state. And the first is that, and these guide the legislation that this committee and this legislature passes. The first is that the internal management of the university is committed to the Board of Regents. So the legislature is not supposed to be managing what happens at the university in a detailed way. Nevertheless, point 2, the legislature may condition university appropriations. The legislature, of course, has that power of the purse, and the legislature can place conditions on money that it gives to the university. But the conditions, in order to meet the constitutional autonomy requirement, they should promote the general welfare, and they should make limited intrusion on regents' powers. So a very sort of hyperbolic example of a bad conditioning of university appropriations would be, we are not going to give you any of your operations and maintenance funding unless you fire that professor I don't like. That's no good. That's a non-starter. Number 3, the university is a state system. They are not above the law, and they are subject to the legislature's general lawmaking power. So when the legislature passes a law that applies to all state systems, all state administration, all state departments, like the Government Data Practices Act, the university is subject to that by default. They are still a part of the state of Minnesota, and they're not above the legislature's lawmaking power. It's because of the university's constitutional autonomy status that you will often see in bills that this committee will hear, and in current statutes, you will see things framed as a request to the University of Minnesota, to the Board of Regents, a request. So we will say, a bill might say, or a statute might say, the Minnesota state colleges and universities have to do this, and we request the Board of Regents to do the same thing. Because internal management is committed to that Board of Regents. However, for the state colleges and universities, which are creatures of statute, the legislature can tell them what to do. So let's talk a little bit about the Board of Regents. There are a few sources of authority for how the Board of Regents is composed. The university's charter, which is of course incorporated into the Constitution, says that there have to be 12 regents, They are elected by a joint convention of the legislature, so the House and the Senate come together to elect regents. They are elected to 6-year terms with no term limit. Based on the way that the territorial legislature passed the law in 1851, regents are staggered into 3 classes. So typically, 4 regents will be up for election every biennium. That is the case this year. I'll talk about regent election in a few more slides. Irregular vacancies, if someone resigns or dies, irregular vacancies are filled by the governor until the next election, when the legislature can or cannot choose to act on that gubernatorial appointee and elect someone to take that place. In addition to those requirements, which are in the charter, right, which is part of the Constitution by reference, there are requirements that that past legislatures have set about how they think the Board of Regents should be composed, and these are in statute. So one of those requirements is that 1 member should be from each of the 8 congressional districts. So you have 8 designated seats and 4 at-large seats, and that 1 of those at-large seats should be a current university student. So this is a bit about the regent election process, which all of you will be involved in this year as members of the legislature and especially as members of this committee. It's really a 3-step process. And just to take one step back, regent election is really important because, like I said, university constitutional autonomy, the legislature can't tell the university what to do in terms of its internal management, what actually goes on there, at the same level of detail it can with the state colleges and universities. So electing regents is your opportunity to determine the direction that the University of Minnesota takes. So big picture, that's why regional election is important. The process proceeds in 3 main stages. First, there is a Regent Candidate Advisory Council that was established by the legislature in statute. They are doing their work right now. They recruit candidates and screen candidates for open seats. They interview those candidates, and they will make recommendations to the Joint Legislative Committee, typically by January 15th. So very soon. They're doing their interviews right now. The next stage is the Joint Legislative Committee, which all of you will be a part of. This is a combination of the House and the Senate higher education committees. They will meet to consider all of RCAC's recommendations. They can accept new candidate nominations, so people that didn't go through the RCAC process can be nominated to be a regent at the Joint Legislative Committee hearing. And their job is to make recommendations to the Joint Convention of the Legislature, which actually elects regents. This typically happens by February 28th. Finally, regents are elected at the Joint Legislative Convention. These receive the Joint Committee's recommendations. Those people are automatically considered nominated to be a regent on the floor. You can also accept new candidate nominations on the floor, so new people can come into this process at any of the 3 stages, and they elect regents. Usually this happens in early March. This is a bit about the Joint Legislative Committee. Again, it's composed of the House and the Senate Higher Education Committees together. It's co-chaired by the 2 chairs, meets by February 28th, and it gives recommendations for the vacancies. Ideally, the Joint Legislative Committee will recommend 1 person for each vacancy to the floor, to the Joint Convention. But in the past, it's not been possible to come to consensus around 1 candidate, and 2 candidates can be recommended for a single vacancy from the Joint Legislative Committee. Here are the results from 2021. 4 congressional districts. RCAC recommended, everyone who's named here went through the RCAC process and was recommended by RCAC. So 3 recommendations from RCAC for each congressional district. The people in red are the people that the Joint Legislative Committee recommended to become a regent. The people with a yellow square around their names are the people that ultimately were elected, and the blue name there, James Farnworth, was a floor nomination. So not nominated because of a recommendation from the Joint Legislative Committee, nominated from the floor, and ultimately elected to be a regent. it's always interesting to see how it breaks down. So this year, again, there'll be 4 regents up, 4 regent vacancies. Rocha, Swigum, Powell, and Johnson's terms will all be up. Johnson is a gubernatorial appointee, and he became a regent after Regent McMillan resigned to become interim chancellor at the University of Minnesota Duluth. So these are the 4 vacancies that will be filled this year.
Mr. Hopkins, I want to go back to 29, our favorite topic, the constitutionality of the University of Minnesota. And I want to go over, in 2013, the legislature froze tuition across the undergraduate systems of both Min-State, or was then MnSCU, and the University of Minnesota. Neither system wanted it. And the legislature coming out of the Great Recession with the problems that we were having with debt, tuition, and getting people back into the job market, we managed to do it. We did craft language on the university side that said they had to freeze tuition undergraduate. We paid for it. This wasn't a freeze without paying for it, and that's a critical component here. So there are ways to make the University of Minnesota listen, and it's basically grabbing them by the budget and not letting go. So that's one of the suggestions I have as we move forward here. Any questions on this? Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I've been in this institution for 14 years, and when we did the tuition freeze this last time, I had no idea before that whenever a tuition freeze was done, that we backfilled them. I'm just like, well, how is that really a true tuition freeze if the taxpayers are still paying for it? That's my question.
Representative Scott, as the architect of the 2013 tuition freeze, I would say this. I would rather have the state pay for these programs to exist and the students not be burdened by 10 years of debt that the systems put on them as a result of increasing tuition. I still have a problem with how they increase tuition and how that tuition is used, and we're going to go over that as we see their budget recommendations. But certainly, what's happened now to 2 of our systems is I think we have priced most of the middle class out of higher education. And it's time now to restore affordability to higher education. I'm talking about the 2, 4, to the extent we can help the privates, and also to the University of Minnesota. Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that explanation. I'm curious, in Minnesota history, has there ever been a tuition freeze that the taxpayers didn't, a true tuition freeze where University of Minnesota, MnSCU, you cannot raise your tuition, we're not going to give you additional funds, maybe we're in a deficit, and we just need to do this. Has there ever been in our history one that really wasn't, kind of
Representative
back?
Scott, the only time we did anything close to that was during the Great Recession when we cut, I think it was $445 million out of the higher education budget. And for 2 consecutive years, there was an 11% increase in tuition as a result of that. If we want sustainability of program, we're going to have to make sure that those programs are there for the students to take. And that means it is our responsibility to fund those programs.
Thank you.
Is there a question over here? Sorry, Vice Chair Rogum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hopkins, if we could return to slide 31 that outlines the U of M regional election process. My question pertains to the Regent Candidate Advisory Council. What is the process by which one becomes a member of RCAC? I mean, it seems like a pretty big responsibility to screen, to recruit, to recommend regents. How does your average Minnesota citizen become a member of RCAC?
Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Chair, Representative Wolgamott, both the speaker, the RCAC's role is to assist the legislature. It's really part of the legislature. So both the speaker and the Senate get a certain number, there are 24 members of the RCAC, so both bodies get to fill 12 seats. There are requirements about only a certain number can be current or former legislators, but each body, each chamber of the legislature gets to fill 12 of the 24 seats.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that information, Mr. Hopkins. So does that mean that the RCAC changes its membership every biennium? So every biennium there's a new, or it's just up to whoever is the currently elected speaker and Senate Majority Leader for that biennium, or what is the process by which there's turnover on the RCAC?
Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Chair, Representative Wolgamott, there are term durations, and they are staggered with the idea that there'll be a churn with RCAC over time. I'm not sure exactly off the top of my head, like what the term year, what the number of years are and how often, how many members are replaced. But yes, I mean, there are durational terms, and they're staggered so that there'll be a constant process of replacement.
Representative Wolgamott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One final question about regents. What is the compensation for regents, or what, are there any financial benefits? Are there any other sort of perks that taxpayers are putting in to these regents, or is it just a completely volunteer position, or what's the sense of compensation for these regents?
Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Chair, Representative Wolgamott, regents are not paid a salary. It is a volunteer position. I believe they're eligible to get per diems and have certain expenses reimbursed, but there is not a paid position.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hopkins, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
More questions? Representative Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Recognizing we have some 44 slides ahead of us, just maybe this is a question for you. Are we at some point going to get further instruction, for lack of a better term, about the Joint Legislative Committee process, or?
Representative Coulter, you're going to get enough instruction where by the time we're done instructing you, you may not want anymore.
Excellent. Then I'll save the question that popped up to me for later.
Yes,
Thank you.
the region selection process is full of instruction. Representative Norr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the phrase of the day is grabbing them by the budget. So it's something-
And not letting go.
absolutely. Just a quick question, couple of questions. I think I'm going through the understanding of the constitutional question. If a state agency is allocating funds, and because we do the allocation to the state agency, what is the role of legislature in terms of that conversation? We can have many programs that may come directly from the federal government, or we may allocate the funds to the departments, and then the departments will work directly with the University of Minnesota.
Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Chair, Representative Noor, so are you speaking just about federal funds that the state might receive?
Representative Norr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hopkins, for example, we received the federal funds for small businesses, and the Department of Deed went directly to work with the University of Minnesota to do the work that the state agency should have been doing or other agencies should have been doing. So do we have legislative authority in terms of how that funding can be used or how we hold University of Minnesota accountable for those funds?
Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Chair, Representative Noor, so the constitutional autonomy issue here, I think that the legislature has power over what, say, Deed can do in terms of how it is free to use those federal funds. The legislature might be able to put some restrictions on that, but it would likely violate constitutional autonomy for the legislature to prohibit the University of Minnesota from engaging with other state agencies cooperatively and administering state funds. So the hook for the legislature there would be the state department or agency that is cooperating with the University of Minnesota. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, Mr. Hopkins, you're saying that the state oversight of those agencies will be key instead of us, trying to work directly with the University of Minnesota. Thank you.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I appreciate that you and I got a nice opportunity to speak before we had this hearing, and I appreciate the tack and the tenor and the direction that you're going. And in relation specifically to the University of Minnesota, I just wanted to kind of publicly ask you also, and I don't see them in the room right now, but maybe they're watching and listening. We had talked a little bit about administrative salaries, and we were going to ask them for that. And so I just want to publicly ask that when they do come, that they would bring those wonderful spreadsheets of all their administrators and their salaries, so that we can kind of see that. And it would be great to see that even in comparison to their faculty and their staff. I'm guessing we're going to see a vast difference between the two, but we'll just wait till the data is in front of us. And
Representative
then,
Neal, I met with the university yesterday, and they gave me a tentative overview of their administrative salaries, and we'll have a much more detailed overview when they do their presentation. So, yes.
wonderful, thank you, Mr. Chair. And then the other request I have is our discussion about, I had done 3 data requests from the University of Minnesota, and they required that I would pay them for that data if I wanted it transmitted. I could sit in their office for hours, I suppose, reading through thousands of documents. I'm not even sure how many they compiled, but I just want to raise that as well as a concern I have, as we of the legislature actually do have oversight. And I realize that we elect regents for that, but I just wanted to raise that concern too as we move forward, specifically to the University of Minnesota.
Representative Neal, I got your emails, 3 of them. I copied all 3 of your attachments out, and I will hand deliver those to the president of the university next Wednesday when I meet with her and their fiscal staff, because I do have concerns. If we're charging members of the legislature for data, there's a whole new area of the university we need to explore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your support in that. I take our responsibility very seriously, as do you,
Yes.
I know.
And we shouldn't be paying for their data. Any other questions? No? I want to return just for a second to Representative Scott's comment and my comments about the cuts that were done after the Great Recession to higher education. I would term this as my interpretation, but when we cut $400 million plus out of these budgets, and the students got an 11% increase in tuition over 2 years, we moved that to balance a $6 billion hole in our budget. So in a sense, we used higher education as a bank, and we put it on the back of the students, for which then they paid for it, if they had debt, for a decade. And that's unconscionable. So when I'm talking about freezing tuition, I'm trying to make higher ed affordable, and I'm trying to ensure that we are not burdening these students. And I think as we proceed with these hearings, and if we don't finish today, we have an abbreviated hearing next Tuesday because we have session. If we don't get through all of this, we'll continue for as long as we can on Tuesday, and then we'll go into session. But our focus is going to be, for the time being, on budget. We need to have a firm understanding of where we're going to go here. So, Representative Scott?
Thank you for that explanation, Chair Pulowski, because I'm new to this committee, and it just seemed absurd to me, because tuition freeze to me should be, and I understand the cut is a different thing than a tuition freeze, but a tuition freeze in my mind was, hey, universities, you cannot charge more for tuition, and you're going to have to find other ways in your budget to shrink your budget, like families have to do. And so that was kind of the point that I was getting at, is this, let's get at the administrative bloat, if there are some majors in colleges that really aren't, for lack of a better term, having enough students participate in those programs. Let's look at ways that the universities can shrink their budgets so they don't have to charge the students more. That's what was going on in my head.
Representative Scott, I agree with you. We did that in 2013 as far as administrative costs go. And at that point, the administrators were getting a bonus for the tough decisions that they were making coming out of the recession. So you had presidents of the state U's and the CC's and others getting a possibility of a $15,000 bonus, and a chancellor getting a $50,000 bonus for making a decision like, I'll raise tuition. That's a tough decision to make, and I'm glad they got a bonus on that. But we eliminated bonuses in the bill that we passed in 2013 as a result of that. You don't get a bonus. This is public service. If you're into bonuses, go somewhere else. Which one? Representative Cleburne again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to be really clear that when we are talking about administrative budgets, I hear the conversation, and bloated executives not really moving students forward. I get that, and I'm on board with looking at that. I just want to make sure that when we're looking at administrative budgets, we're not cutting librarians and people who are in that administrative category who actually add to a student getting through the institution as quickly as possible to get their degrees. And so when we're talking about administration, let's make sure that we're all on the same page with whatever vocabulary we're going to use as a committee. I'll leave it at that.
Representative Cleburne, the last time we did this, librarians weren't included, and nor were any essential support staff. That's a whole different category of administration.
Well, when I was looking at the budget books in the, excuse me, Mr. Chair, when I was looking at the budget books in the very beginning of my term here, those were cuts that were made under the guise of cutting administration. And so what we have is professors who could be spending their time doing research or serving students, now making copies and things, or going to look for things that other staff previously did for them. So I
But
just want to
that's-
make sure we're utilizing our resources.
Representative Cleaver, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, and that is not the direction that we are going to go, or that we did go in 2013. So, any further questions? Who's next? Mr. Hopkins, are you still rolling?
Yep, Mr. Chair and members, so the last third and final part of my piece of the presentation here is about the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities System, formerly MnSCU. We call them MnState now. There was a rebranding. So if you hear MnSCU, people still say MnSCU. It's the same thing. There are 7 state universities. Average tuition's $9,894 a year. This is just tuition and fees, not full cost of attendance. Room and board is not included here. I've listed the 7 state universities with their total enrollments and much of those students are full-time students. There are also 26 state colleges. They're listed all here. A few highlights here. So we have average annual full-time tuition and fees, $6,123. A few highlights. New to this list, Minnesota North Community College. So this is a consolidation of Hibbing, Itasca, Mesabi Range, Rainy River, and Vermilion. Another sort of interesting highlight, Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. So not technical and community college. That's why I didn't want to make that just a C. So this is it's co-governed by the Minnesota State system and the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. So the Minnesota State system, a bit of history here, came about through the 1991 merger of 3 different systems. So before 1991, you had the technical colleges, which were governed separately, and governance there was shared between a state board and local school districts. Technical colleges were focused on vocational and occupational education, and the faculty at technical colleges were actually employed by the local school district. So that was one thing that got merged together with community colleges, which were also governed by their own separate state board, and the state universities, which had their own separate state board. So these 3 separate boards were merged together into a single system. Effective in 1995, the law was passed in 1991. The goals of the merger were to remove duplicative academic programming, eliminate duplicative administration and student services, and centralize those services for more efficiency, to allow easier credit transfer among institutions and between institutions, and to centralize funding to avoid favoritism and serve broader statewide interests.
Mr. Hopkins, I'm going to just let you pause for a second because I have a architectural artifact. This is how budgets were once presented to our committees. You'll note there are no graphics in here, but there are something called change orders. So every account has a change order, which explains why the budget went up or down inside that particular account. You also notice the tabs here are for the community colleges, the technical colleges, the state U's, University of Minnesota, and I think the grant program. So this is how we once did it, and it was extremely detailed. So if something went up or down or stayed the same, there was an explanation, at least in the governor's proposal to do it. I'm going to pass it around. Be careful with it. It's getting a little delicate, but you can see, and this is what I would eventually like to return to at some time, a more detailed look at how we do budgets by account. Not have a PowerPoint presentation where the fonts are as big as a Volkswagen and we have little graphics and videos, and then at the end they say, give us $3 billion, and you go, for what? I want to make sure we know when we're investing the money, how we're investing it and why we're investing it, and if we're taking something out and moving it, we better have a good explanation for it. So you can I'll bring that back if you want to, but it's also in my office, and I think I just got part of it all over me, but that's all right. Representative O'Neill, do you have a question?
I just wanted to make a quick comment. I just cannot tell you how much I appreciate that strategy and returning us to the way it used to be. I've only been on this, I think this is my third time being on the higher ed committee, but each and every time I had the exact same reaction that you did, what you just explained. And I've had a conversation with the minority, and we are in full support of that deep dive and that very strong look at everything and a very good explanation that we can actually ask additional questions about. So we're in support of that strategy, and I just want to thank you for bringing that forward.
And I'll thank Representative Lyndon Carlson. He's the one who taught me. So we sat and went through that booklet for several weeks, and that's all we did, account by account by account. So I don't think we're going to do quite that, but we are going to do a lot more budget work than we've done in the past. Okay, sorry for interrupting you, Mr. Hopkins, but proceed.
No problem. Mr. Chair and members, so Minnesota State is governed by a 15-member board of trustees. These folks are all appointed by the governor, and they serve staggered 6-year terms. There are student members. All 8 congressional districts are represented. There is traditionally a labor member that the AFL-CIO will recruit and recommend to the governor. Those recommendations are non-binding. There is a trustee in statute, there is a trustee candidate advisory council, like the Regent Candidate Advisory Council, which would make recommendations, non-binding recommendations to the governor. But that's been inactive since 2012.
Mr. Hopkins, but we don't elect the trustees.
Mr. Chair, that's correct.
Yes, that's a critical difference. We do not. There's no trustee election.
Mr. Chair and members, so the one feature of Minnesota State colleges and universities to highlight, in addition to their role educating students, giving them post-secondary credentials, is Minnesota State's unique role in terms of workforce development here in Minnesota. There are 2 things that I wanted to highlight. First is customized training. This is not a legislative program. It's not a statutory program. It's something that Min-State does. They will partner with employers to provide customized training to their employees. And in the table there, I have the revenue that's been generated through customized training, Min-State partnerships with the private sector. Another program, which this is a legislative program, it is in statute, are workforce development scholarships. These are scholarships of $2,500 a year that can be given to Min-State students in these fields, which have been designated by the legislature: advanced manufacturing, agriculture, early childhood education, healthcare, information technology, and transportation. Mr. Chair, that concludes my section of the presentation. Unless there are any member questions, Mr. Savory will be running through some of the fiscal numbers next.
Any questions, members on this? Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering why the trustee advisory or a candidate advisory council has been inactive since 2012. That's more than a decade now.
Mr. Hopkins.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative Engel, I don't know. The governor, the past governors, I guess, have not found it useful, and it just hasn't been active in the way that our CAC has.
Representative O'Neill, I've been toying with the idea of returning to something else in this committee too. A section that dealt with repealing things that don't work or are obsolete, and that we should eliminate them. This might be a candidate for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So is this something then that the governor, does he do the appointments also to the trustee?
I'm not that familiar with the statutory problem with this, but we once had a section like that where we would do repealers. In fact, Governor Dayton wanted the second year to be the unsession, and I agreed with him completely. We should take a look at what's on the books that doesn't work, and we should primarily focus on repealing and revising what we've already done.
Yeah.
And we'll have an element of that in this committee, too.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I remember that well. I remember that session well. There were lots and lots of pieces of statute that were no longer relevant or useful. I recall when, we're asked as members to put down our preferences for different advisory councils and so on, and it's still on the list, so it seems to me that either the speaker or the minority leader or something must make recommendations for that. I'm not quite sure, but it'd be
We'll
interesting.
find out.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I just feel like we're a little bit removed from anything with the trustees. It's, once in a while, we'll have a trustee. Usually, it's been in the past, I believe Roger Moe has come in the past. So sometimes we see a trustee or two once in a while here, but I feel like we're a bit removed from them.
Representative O'Neill, I had Roger Moe in my office last week with the chancellor. I think Trustee Moe is going to be highly engaged in this budget. And when we see their budget presentation, you'll know why.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Was there a question over here that I missed? Somebody? No. All right. Let's pass it that way. Proceed.
Oh, Mr. Chair, just one to answer Representative O'Neill's question. The Trustee Candidate Advisory Council, like RCAC, consists of 24 members, 12 appointed by the House and 12 appointed by the Senate. And Mr. Chair, if there are no further questions, Mr. Savory can take over the
Savory.
presentation.
Mr. Chair and members, for the tape again, Ken Savory, House Fiscal Staff. There are quite a few slides here. It seems unlikely we'll get through them all today, but we'll go at a relatively brisk pace in the beginning and get to some of the number ones in the middle. First slide, just want to familiarize the committee with the various budget periods that the state deals with. So the state fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. We are in the latter portion of FY23, and that will come to a conclusion on July 1st. This is different than the federal fiscal year, which is October 1st to September 30th. And as I said before, our current biennium, we're in the FY22, FY23 biennium, coming to a close soon. And then our upcoming biennium, which this committee and various other committees in the legislature will be budgeting for, is for FY24, FY25, that 2-year period. And that FY24 period begins on July 1st. So as the legislature removes itself from session, as it adjourns, that next budget period, which the legislature will set a budget for, will start in July. Just want to familiarize everyone with a couple of series of budget terms that this committee and others have and will use. I want to focus first on the direct appropriation. This is the form of funding, the form of appropriations that this committee will likely use the most. For members working on various bills, you'll recall that you're probably wanting to do funding for a specific institution, a specific agency, for a specific period of time, meaning it'll be X number of dollars to Department X for the FY24-25 biennium or some other year. We'll talk about a little bit that in a little bit. Those are done in session law. So when their budgets are in session law, that's what the direct appropriation is doing. Session law lasts for a certain period of time. Legislature revisits it in the future. The statutory appropriation is a little bit different. That is done within state statute, and that recurs until the legislature decides to change it or to get rid of it. So it is more permanent or permanent. And then the open appropriation is a type of statutory appropriation where it is very similar to a statutory appropriation, which is automatic, but it is more of a formula. So think something like the Destination Medical Center in Rochester. That has a formula in which that economic development institution gets money, and it openly appropriates it as it meets those criteria in law. So think formula, think K-12 funding. Those are kind of the items that kind of go into that category. Moving on to the next set of budget terms, there are two very important ones. The first one being the base. At the Minnesota legislature, our budgeting is typically done or is done as a base formula. So we will look at the previous year's appropriations, make decisions about those appropriations, and then put them into session law. So for example, appropriations made in FY23 provide and establish the base for appropriations in FY24-25. Unless there is language within that rider, within that session law that says the base is different or does not exist. So it can be one time, meaning it doesn't go beyond this biennium, or it can extend into the tails, which we'll talk about right now in the bottom bullet.
Mr. Savory, stay with that for a second. A base adjustment versus one-time money. Just explain that again.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. So one-time funding, as the name suggests, happens one time within the biennium. It can happen in either year. Specifically, from a drafting perspective, it may be preferred if you're going to do a one-time funding item in a biennial period, is to put it in the first year of the biennium. That way there's no confusion whether it is ending or where it is ending and starting. So for example, a one-time funding item would be in FY24 and would stop in FY24 and would not occur in FY25. Another way to do it would be to have an appropriation in FY25 and to specify via language saying this is a one-time appropriation, meaning it does not incur costs or projected costs into the tails.
So, Mr. Savory, if I have a $35 million base adjustment, how is that different than one time? We take it as 35, but explain what that means.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a good segue into the tails idea. So for example, let's say in terms of even numbers, it was a $30 million appropriation. So $15 million would be in the first year, and $15 million could be in the second year of the biennium. So so that would be in 24 and 25, and in FY26 and 27, the last year would carry forward. So 15 and 15. So 30 and 30. So together, a $60 million projection over the course of those 4 years, over those two bienniums. The difference in that is that groups, institutions, agencies may request a staggered approach. So let's take the example of that same $30 million. You'd go 15 and 15, which we would call as flat. Potentially more problematic for budgets may be 10 million in the first year, 20 million in the second year, which by budget rules would obligate 20 million in FY26 carrying forward, and then 20 million in FY27. So what we thought would be a $30 million obligation to this committee in FY24-25 is now a $40 million obligation in the tails. Now, to be clear, the tails just set the case of the next discussion for the next legislature. And certainly in the odd or in the even numbered year session, the legislature could adjust that, but it forces decision-making kind of down the line.
Mr. Savory, and you just pointed out one of the problems we're going to have with the surplus. There is a section of the surplus that's one time, and there is a section of the surplus that's ongoing. And how we deal with that, or what numbers we're given. I don't know what target we're going to get here. If we're going to get an ongoing target, or if we're going to get a one-time target, or a mix. And depending on how that happens, it will greatly impact how we put the money into play. So thank you, Mr. Savory.
Mr. Chair, that takes care of this set of slides. We're going to go on next to the budget process. This is kind of more of a calendar, and I often have this on my desk, and I kind of tick off the left-hand boxes as we kind of accomplish them throughout the session. So obviously, we've ticked out the box for early December. The legislature, or the November forecast, has been released. The legislature is now in session, has convened, and the governor will be making those the governor's budget recommendations will be coming the fourth Tuesday in January. So in layman's terms, roughly January 24th on or before. And then legislative bill deadlines will be established, fiscal deadlines as well as policy deadlines. At the end of February, MMB will release the February economic forecast, which will be our final preview of what the biennial math will be in terms of the available resources. And then in March, Ways and Means Committee and Senate leadership will establish targets to which Chair Pulaski referred to earlier. The target is the amount of money allocated for a specific committee or division of the House or Senate, or specifically for the House. So that number will either be positive or negative, or will be flat or stay the same. And those will be for all the finance committees that have accounts within the House. In April, omnibus bills or financing bills will leave the floor, and then conference committee will begin with the Senate. And then in May, conferences will conclude, they'll adjourn. Those conference reports will come back to the origin, in that case going back to the House or the Senate, and those will move between the bodies and passed or sent back to conference committee and or sent to the governor in May for his signature or veto. And that will kind of conclude the budget process for this particular session. And so, Mr. Chair, I was just going to stop here. I know you had some questions earlier, and stop here for members in case there was any questions on the budget terms.
Members, we're about to run out of time. I would request that you leave all your materials in your packet, and we'll return on Tuesday. We won't have a full committee hearing, but we'll probably have enough time to finish this, and that may give you some time to come up with questions when we conclude this. I want to thank both Mr. Hopkins and Mr. Savory. We had 2 meetings in order to prepare for this, and they've done a very good job of putting materials together. Our first budget hearing will be with the Min-State system, and when I meet with you individually, or if I meet with both caucuses in a group here, some of you already know what the problem, the scope of the problem that we're going to have with their budget request. So with that, meeting is adjourned.